I'd done it the same with, I must have done Mum as well.
Well, she had a very interesting life, and she went through an awful lot of Bristol Blitz and things like that.
That's right, yeah, I talked to her a little bit about it.
Yeah.
I don't really know about that. And the also thing I wanted to ask about, because I remember things from my childhood and things like having that railway engine with hammer and sickle on the front of it and
Yeah.
things. And that must have been at the height of the Cold War and things, and why that
Well, we used to take you and Suzanne on political demonstrations in the Manchester area. Yeah. Well, you don't know that when I was in the Air Ministry, worked in Bristol, you know, they wanted to send me to, I think this was before you were born. No, you weren't. You were born. That was Air Ministry, that's right. You must have been about a year old or something like that. And they wanted to send me to Aden, you see, in the Persian Gulf. And I said, I'm not going. He said, why aren't you going? I said, well, I went to 22 different bloody countries during the war. And I know Aden. He said, did you go there? I said, no, I didn't. I said, but I know it's only got one tree and it's reputed that somebody ran into that. And he said, well, it's not that bad. He said, well, then it's part of your contract that you've got to go to Aden. So I said, well, I'm not going to Aden. So he said, well, I don't want you to go to Aden, because if you go to Aden, who am I going to play chess with, you see? And it was my boss, this, you see. So I said, well, that's hard luck. If I go to Aden, you won't have anybody. And I said, if I don't go to Aden, you won't. So he said, no. Oh, well. He said, won't you change your mind? I said, no, I'm not going to Aden. And so on. And he said, well, you might have to leave us. I said, well, I might have to. And I thought, well, I'll go back in the printing trade, do something like that. Anyway, about 3 days later, he sent for me. He said, the stationery office will have you. I said, what do you mean? He said, they've agreed, they'll take you see, in the stationery office. So I said, oh, good. And that's how I went to the stationery office.
So you weren't purged then?
Well, I tried to be, but that didn't work. Well, with this Aden business, you know, I said, well, I want to leave the Air Ministry. He said, you can't leave the Air Ministry. I said, yes, I can. He said, no, you can't. I said, well, I'm a communist, you see. So he said, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am. He said, no, you're not. I said, I am. I said, you tell them. I said, and then they'll purge me and they'll send me to another ministry. So he said, well, if you tell me officially, I've got to tell them. So he told them. And the funny thing is, in the Air Ministry, they didn't like Persian people, and they wouldn't do it. And there was a tale of this bloke in Leicester, and he was quite active in the Communist Party in Leicester. So they decided that he came up for overseas posting. So they sent him to Singapore. So somebody said, oh, it's a bloody awful journey by air to Singapore. Get your doctor to say you're not well enough to go by air. Say it wouldn't suit you and so on. And he said, what would that do? He said, then they send you by sea. So he did it. He got a 3-month bloody voyage by sea to Singapore. Lovely, you know, like cruise ship. When he got to Singapore, gets off the ship, goes to the office, reports, then goes to join the Singapore Communist Party. And Singapore, they picked it up straight away. And within a week, they've got him back on the bloody ship, sent him back to England. So he gets back to England, goes to Leicester, and it comes up to the chief in the Air Ministry. And they come up, and he says, and the chief says, what's this then? He said, well, you've got to get rid of him from the Air Ministry because he's a communist. And this bloke said, he said, these bloody Labour people, they always want to interfere with people's rights and freedom. So, and he said, let's have a look at his record. And he said, he's got a bloody good war record, this bloke. He said, I'm not having it. So they wouldn't purge him. He still kept his job. You know, bugger had a free bloody holiday on a ship and everything. And the Air Ministry was like that. And when I said it, they said, all right, that's all right, leave it, do nothing. They weren't prepared to do it, you see. And it just shows if they stood up to how these people could do it. No, it was because I wouldn't go to bloody Aden. That's why I left it. But I went to the station office. I didn't mind that at all. It was quite good. And that's how I started. And it was 1958 that we started the business of stopping pensions being done by a plea to Parliament, and had it changed over to relating to the pay of individuals. And then Thatcher switched it over to prices. And the Labour Party never undid it.
Okay, well, we'll get to that tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll have a go tomorrow.
Okay, thanks, Dad.
It'll probably be in the afternoon again, eh?
Well, whenever you want, really.
Probably.
I prefer in the morning because I want to get back home and things.
Well, she worked for the Communist Party in Bristol, and when I came from Bournemouth, I was propaganda secretary for the Hampshire area, south of England, and that's how I came to the district office where she was working. That's where I met her, and then.
Do you know why she joined the Communist Party?
Well, family, her mother and sister and brother-in-law. You know, it was they were linked to the party from quite long before I knew them. You know, and I think she was. I think she was in it during the war as well, because the police tried to get her sacked from some firm. So obviously she was in it. Yeah. Fortunately, you know, the police used to try and get rid of people, and often the reaction was to just disregard the police and not believe them. A bit like today, really, isn't it? They're bloody useless.
What sort of beliefs did she have? I mean, because what sort of communist was she? What sort of communist was she? What were her interests? Why was she motivated to be in the Communist Party?
Well, I don't really know.
But you must have talked politics with her when you first met her and things like that.
Well, of course we went. There was at Timsbury near Bristol. There was a big school, you know, where it was owned by quite a big estate, and they used to have sort of weekend get-togethers and speakers come and so on, and some quite well-known ones like Tommy Jackson, who he wrote Ireland Their Own, which is a famous publication about the history of Ireland, and he was just an ordinary working man who wrote that, and he was a printer actually in his time, but there were lots of people who used to come there, like, you know, Harry Pollitt and Haldane and all sorts of quite top people. But
did you have the same sort of views as Mum, or did you have different approaches and things?
No, we're more or less the same. We're more or less always the same, yeah.
Anything about? Could you say what she believed, or what sort of motivated her and things?
It's very difficult to know what motivates. I think she thought everything was terribly unfair on ordinary people, compared with the way the rich got away with everything, and, you know, basically a reaction. But it was more... I don't think it was based on coming to it because of experience. It was because of theory and understanding and discussion within our family. And Dennis, in his time, I think, was very much concerned. And they'd always been progressive, because she had relatives in Street in Somerset and places like that. And they were in the cooperative movement and so on. It was in the labour movement generally, you know, that and so on. But I think what it comes down to it is that the communists at least were always doing something, whereas the others were always talking about it. And I think that's probably what similar.
What campaigns were there after the war when you came back from the army? What was the Communist Party doing during that first period after the war and things?
A bit difficult to remember what the campaigns were about. Well, the campaigns were to try and persuade the Labour government to do more progressive in its approach, not to compensate so lavishly the mine owners and the shareholders in the railways, and these things that were bankrupt were being bought by the government at about 100 times more than they were worth. And in the case of the miners, the charge against the mining industry of the previous owners was so high that it almost made the coal expensive. And there were campaigns like that. There was campaigns, the peace campaign in general. The CND campaign was prevalent at that time against atomic weapons and so on. The campaign to try and get the Americans out of Britain, where they...
In 1948 you went to a peace conference in Paris.
That's right, yeah.
What was that about? Was there anything worth saying about
Well,
that?
it was a world peace conference where they...
In 1948 you went to a peace conference in Paris.
That's right, yeah.
What was that about? Was there anything worth saying about
Well,
that?
it was a world peace conference, and it was very well supported and well attended. And, we went there, and and the French, of course, were a very strong communist country at that time. The Communist Party in France, and their newspaper Humanité was very well supported and so on, and lots of towns and cities in France had communist councils running them and so on. At that time it was very high in France, it was quite good. I don't know what happened in France.
So you went with Mum there to the conference?
Yes,
Were you married then, or just...
Yes. We got married in 48.
So was that like a honeymoon then at this peace conference?
No, it wasn't a honeymoon. It was about a year afterwards. The first thing we went to was a Bastille Day celebration. That's the first time we went to Paris. And then when we went to the peace conference, that was a year afterwards, actually. I don't know.
Did you meet people from the resistance there?
Yes.
So who did you meet then?
Well, we met George and Suzanne, who we stayed with in their flat. And he was an electrician, but he was in the resistance. And he was reputed to have shot some German officer on one of the stations in, I don't know whether it was called Stalingrad Station. It was eventually in I don't know whether they still do, I mean.
No, it is. It's a metro station called Stalingrad.
A metro station. It used to be called Stalingrad. I don't know. Is it still?
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, he shot a German officer there.
Yeah. And his wife, Suzanne, she joined the Communist Party during the German occupation. And then they had a friend called Rose, and she was a very nice woman, very, very courageous. And she got arrested by the Gestapo and taken to their headquarters to be interrogated. And she said it was a bit like an ordinary police station, and they were all sitting on benches waiting to be called in to be interrogated. And she suddenly thought, well, nobody knows anybody here, you see, so she waited for an opportunity and just sort of stood up, walked out, and then ran and buggered off, and went to the country and got out their way and evaded, what do you call it? And they had certificates of their resistance work, and they were signed by two main signatories, Chief of Police and General Secretary of the Communist Party. To say they were resistance workers. Very good people, very, very good. They were very interesting.
So Suzanne impressed you a lot, did she?
Hmm?
Suzanne impressed you a lot. If you named your daughter after Suzanne.
Oh yeah, well she was George's wife, and they were very, very nice people. We liked them very much.
Nobody's called George though.
No,
Well, you might have got called George, except my dad was called George, so we didn't. But
you were going to call your first child Suzanne, you said last night.
well, that's why. So you should have been Suzanne, really. You see,
But not George.
not George. No,
So why did Suzanne impress you more than George?
I don't know. There it is. Well, perhaps I don't know. It must have been my assessment, you see, because it was probably a bit of male chauvinist attitude. We thought the men ought to be in the resistance. We never thought of women being so courageous. And I was very impressed by that somebody at a time of resistance, when the Germans were in Paris and there in force, at that time should join the Communist Party of all things, you know. That's obviously the thing about it. Yeah. But we lost touch with them, unfortunately, and they might have moved and how it was. But we stayed with them, and I forget which arrondissement they lived in, but it was one of the, might have been Montmartre, one of the poorer working class areas, but
So,
very interesting, Paris is.
so during the 50s and things, the Cold War was starting and things
Yeah.
like that. Cold War was starting and things
Yeah.
like that. So how did that change what was happening in the Communist Party and how you were treated in the civil service and things?
Well, I found the civil service fairly good, actually, because I don't think we were badly treated. You know, because the civil service, it had very progressive trade unions, so we were fairly well defended. And most of the civil service unions had either communists or communist sympathiser, full-time officers and representatives. And like myself, for instance, I fairly quickly became section president in the HM stationery office, and I held a job, and people stood against me, didn't beat me for 5 years, and I only left it when I got promoted and went into the executive grade, which was a different union, and I was always active, and the only time, I would say generally, the civil service itself was very, very fair and treated people well. I can remember a colleague who was in the International Brigade, went on a promotion board, and on the promotion board they said to him, they said, Mr. Longstaff, tell us about your political activity, you see. So he sort of thought, well, they don't know much about me.
Yeah.
So he more or less said he was active in the union and he did this and he was, you know, always very progressive and so on. And one of the board said, yes, but Mr. Longstaff, you fought in the International Brigade in Spain, you're a member of the Communist Party. And he said, bloody hell, you know more about it than me. and the reports were there, but they didn't affect, he got his promotion, no, they didn't stop him. But the only time that I was victimised was quite late. I was a higher executive officer, I was an executive officer at the time, and it was at the time when Peter Walker was the minister, and he came and he refused to accept a petition against the government's pay restrictions, and a minister on the MPNI had been to South Wales and had accepted a petition from the staff openly and reasonably, and he wouldn't. So when I was in contact with him, I said, if he won't accept it, we won't accept him. And if he comes to open our building, we walk out. So then they had a message from one of his minions to say that he would accept the petition, but behind closed doors, so nobody could see it and anything like that. So we said, well, we've nothing to hide. What have you got to hide? So we won't do that. And then they send the police down when he comes, bloody coachload of police, and I protest there, and I would go to the police and say, what do you lot want, you know? And they said, we're here to protect you. We don't want protecting. And he said, you do? He said, there's anarchists about. And I said, I'm sure there's anarchists about. Anybody in the civil service with a being run like this is an anarchist. You can't believe in government. And I thought, he doesn't know what an anarchist was, even the policeman. Anyway, the police were there, but they didn't do anything. And
I just need to change something here, so because the sun's come out, so I have to put a filter in it.
Anyway, Peter Walker turned up and came in to open the building, and he went in, and they were going to have a meeting in one of the meeting rooms. And as he was going in, there were reporters following on, and there was a girl reporter from the Daily Worker there, and we called over to her, and we said, as soon as we start our meeting, draw attention to us. And she said, right, I'll do that. And what happened actually was, they went into this room and they all settled down in the meeting room, and we were out on the lawn in front of the building, and you know, and our branch chairman was opening the meeting, and this girl stood up and pointed out the window, and she said, what's going on out there? I want to know what's going on. Before he could even start speaking. And on the news that night, throughout the... There you are, and they do that to you.
You're going to have to make it a bit shorter if you want to go to town, because I've got lots of questions I want to ask you, so make your answers shorter.
Yeah, and and that ruined his meeting and so on. But about 10 months later, I was due for a promotion, boarding for the next higher grade, and so was Jim, my colleague, and I got a board and I went for promotion, and then the result came out and I wasn't going to be promoted. So because I'd not been very well, I asked for a reboarding on the grounds I was taking antibiotics and perhaps I didn't do as well as I should. And a colleague called Jewel, he's dead now, so it doesn't matter, he rang me up and he said, what do you want another board for, Jeff? I said, because, you know the rules, I'm entitled to one if I was being medicated and or not well enough to have done as well as I should. And he said, you passed the board, and so did Jim. So I said, well, and why aren't we being promoted? He said, well, I can't tell you over the phone because it may be tapped. This is, you know, minister phones. And so he said, come to London and see me. So I went up and saw Bob Jewell, and he said, there's nothing we can do about it. He said, Peter Walker's put a top document on you both, not to be promoted for 18 months because of what you did to him when you... So I said, well, let's take it to Parliament, let's do the bastard, you know. He said, do you think you get promoted if you do that? And so I said, well, no, I suppose not. I said, but it's not right that he gets away with it. He said, it's not the only thing he's getting away with. So he persuaded me to do nothing. Because he said in 2 months' time it's off. He said it was only on for 18 months. He said you'll be on a board and so would Jim and we bloody will get you through. And that was it. That's how I got the promotion.
So going back to the Cold War and just before, well, just
Yeah.
after we were born and things.
Yeah.
Why were we named why were your two children named, or why were we named Maxim and Suzanne? Can you tell us the story about that?
How do you mean?
Well, where did you get the names from?
Where did we get the names from?
Yeah.
Well, I told you, from...
Tell the viewers.
Tell you what?
Just tell us why you named your children what you named them, or why you named us what you named them.
Well, Maxim was because we couldn't think of anything at all, because we expected a girl, so we eventually, I had about 3 books with names in, and we searched through, and eventually came to Maxim, and it said, first used by a Roman general who couldn't think of a name for his son. And it was also Maxim Gorky, who we rather liked, his books and things like that. And somebody also said it might have been the Maxim gun as well, you see. So, but that's how that one came about, and we liked it. And as I said before, if it's on this, that Suzanne was named after somebody we admired in the French resistance in Paris. And that was it. And Catherine was after a person who gave us our first flat when we were married in Clifton, in her house, who was a teacher of art in the academy in Bristol, and a very strong left-wing member of the Labour Party. She was probably a communist in every way except she thought the way to help get communism was to be within the Labour Party and influence the Labour Party, as lots of people did in those days. They stayed in the Labour Party, but they took a lot of their leadership from the Communist Party. So the Communist Party was very influential on the Labour Party, and they could do with one now to influence this lot.
And Julius, who was that after?
Well, he was a he was a Czech resistance fighter who was arrested and executed by the Germans in Prague.
Do you know his name?
Julius Fuchik. He's in history. You come across him somewhere.
In the 50s, there was a lot of colonial battles being fought. What did the Communist Party do to support those?
Colonial battle?
Malaysia, the Mau Mau. What was the
Well, the Communist Party always tried to tell people the truth about these things, and now not to always take as fact what the newspapers tell them, and to try to tell them the truth about it. And also, it was a fight against colonialism, wasn't it? It was a fight against... Britain seemed to want to be accepted as a democratic country and retain its empire. Churchill didn't want to get rid of India, for instance. He would have liked to retain India, and they used Stafford Cripps and Mountbatten and all sorts of other people to ease it through. But the old divide and rule thing did a lot of damage. That between the Pakistan and India, so that instead of it being what it should have been one big united India. It ended up Pakistan and India. So the damage was done in the way they resisted it. Then other countries, they did get their independence of sorts when eventually Britain had to give it up. We ceased to be able to retain it. But the party was always against the colonialism and so on. But the danger from America, I don't know when that really was apparent. The domination in world politics, I don't know when that really started. Pity it ever did, but I don't know when it did.
So when Stalin died in 53,
yeah,
and then Hungary in 56, what did you think of those events? And what happened in the Communist Party in 56? What did you think of those events? And what happened in
Well,
the Communist Party then?
I wasn't. I've always seen that a lot of the things that were wrong weren't entirely caused by the Russians. I think they were caused by the antagonism of the West against the Russians. They weren't even given a chance to have trade and normal relations with any country that the Americans could influence not to trade with them by threats or withdrawing of help and things like that. So we don't know how the world would have progressed if at the end of the war the sort of comradeship and the partnership that existed fighting against the evil of fascism had remained and said, well, let's make a better world of it. Roosevelt would have done that. Roosevelt unfortunately died, but Roosevelt was to a large extent in favour of trading with the Russians, working with the Russians, rebuilding with the Russians and so on. But Churchill was anti-Soviet, anti-communist in the extreme, and he wanted to destroy the relationship. And he was afraid because the British Communist Party went up to, I think, something like 70,000 members in the you know, at the time of the war, and you couldn't count the Army and Navy and Air Force membership because we weren't allowed to belong to political parties. Surprising what you can do when you don't belong to it, but there it is. But the Air Force in India and overseas were in mutiny and revolt and so on. Navy was the same, they wanted to get out. And the Army was the same, you know, wanted to get released and out. And it, you know, makes you think, you know, that the forces where they've got, you know, they've got all their propaganda against anything happening, still happens. And I often wonder what went wrong. Why does America have such power? And they have. And when they get defeated, they still come out of defeat still powerful, don't they? You know, they're defeated in Vietnam, and they still come out powerful, don't they?
Well, yeah, that's different. So, they're defeated in Iraq, but to be honest, they're not using.
Oh, bloody hell.
But to be defeated, it doesn't always mean, you know, unless you're defeated where you're invaded and the enemy takes, you know, goes and takes over your country.
Then they start building up better and stronger themselves, don't they? They would do, wouldn't they? How you get a better America, I don't know.
But tell me about, so what about when Hungary in '56 and then the 20th Congress with the Khrushchev speech and things, how did that affect?
Well, that was very confusing. I tried to understand it as best I could, and I sort of, I don't know really. You see, when you get people say things about so many thousand people are in prison in the Soviet Union, and then you take their total population, and then you take what percentage of their total population is in prison. If you applied those to ours, we'd reduce our population to about a third or a quarter of what it is at present. Because relative to the percentage of the people seemed to me to be about normal, because every society has got its criminal elements and people who are doing wrong, and everybody that was imprisoned and sort of sent to Siberia into these open labour camps, they weren't necessarily innocent. They're made out to be because they were perhaps funded by our non-innocence. So I don't know, and it was very confusing. But at that time, I don't know what had happened. I'd lost a lot of. I don't know whether it was internal things in the British Communist Party. I lost a lot of faith in the way things were going in Britain rather than anywhere else. And I don't know.
I mean, for us, it was strange having a family, a communist family.
Yeah.
What did you think about having children who were living in a communist family in the house and then going out and going to a normal school? Things. I mean, with
very difficult, I should imagine. It was something, but we never tried. Look, we never tried to tell the children, either of you, not to do religion at school. We never said that. We never ever tried to tell you to do anything at school. We expected you to behave at school as civilised people, as we would anywhere. We behaved civilised. We always believed in law. I always do. And if the law's wrong, I'll seek to change it. But I wouldn't break it until it's got rid of. You know, I might break it to try to get rid of it, but you know, I think it's basic. And we never did. But I mean, both of you didn't want to do religion. Well, that was all right. So therefore, we felt it necessary that we would support you. But I don't know. You tell me. When you were at school, you did far more things than I expected. I mean, this Cardiff Union of Secondary Schools that was organised, it was a fantastic organisation, that. I mean, there the kids could see more than the parents, they could see more than the council that was running the schools or anything. You could see how wasteful it was to have a girls' school and a boys' school, to have two science laboratories when one good one would do for both. The segregation of the sexes, they were against that. They were against school uniforms being rigidly, you know, must wear your school cap, you must do this, must do that, you know. And that was something. Why should we discourage good progressive thought? And you yourselves related to good school teachers who reacted with you. And the bad ones react even worse. They're terrible. But that's the way. But we didn't influence. I don't think we told you not to do religion or anything. Did we? We weren't religious. Why did we become religious? Just because you go to a school that wants you to be religious? You know, why? Did you think we tried to influence you?
No. I was just wondering more about you. I remember you made a train for me, yeah?
Yes.
With a hammer and sickle on the front.
Yes.
Yeah? And how old was I then? So about 5 or 6, yeah? At 1957.
I didn't know there was a hammer and sickle. It could have been on the front. Well, I made that first of all for Jonathan. And then when he grew up and grew out of it, it came back and I remade it again and you had it, and it was a good train, that.
But it was a bit strange that it would be like painted red with a hammer and sickle at the height of the Cold War.
Oh, I see. Oh, well, I mean, the Cold War was for people who wanted it. It wasn't for everybody. And also, you know, the Cold War wasn't supported by the Daily Worker, or it wasn't supported by trade unions. You know, this was a Tory Cold War and an American Cold War. It was being imposed on people. They weren't enthusiastic for it. People weren't anti-Russian, really. But, I mean, the stories didn't do any good for the left-wing movement, obviously. They meant people that would be nice, useful for us, perhaps couldn't just come with us.
What was that you were telling us last night about the Soviet Friendship Society?
British Soviet Friendship Society? Yeah, well, I was secretary of it in Bristol, and I organised a big concert there, and in the Colston Hall, 2,000 people there. And we also had a visit of an astronaut, and you were there actually. And
what, Yuri Gagarin?
No, not Yuri Gagarin. That was in Manchester, and Mum went to see Yuri Gagarin and met him. She met Yuri Gagarin.
Gagarin.
Yuri
Gagarin.
Yeah.
She met him.
She did. Mum did. Yeah.
She had his autograph, didn't she?
Yeah, she had it. Yeah, she had everything. Yeah.
Oh, she get to meet the handsome white
Yeah.
man.
Oh,
But there was no cosmonauts then, was there? That early on.
No, not in the 50s.
There was no what?
Well, Yuri Gagarin was the first cosmonaut.
Oh yes, definitely. Yes, he was the first.
Astronaut.
And he came over. And there's a story in Manchester that they had these like Hyde Park, you know, open air speakers, and there was some religious speaker in Manchester standing on his soapbox, you know, giving his speech about religion, and there's a bloke in the crowd who was in the Plumbers Union, and the Plumbers Union had given membership to Yuri Gagarin, and when this bloke paused, he said, hey, one of my members, and he says, one of my members has been up there, and there's no there. He was a lovely man, was Yuri Gagarin. And other Russians, we had who was the chess champion? Boris Spassky, yeah. He came and played the Welsh Chess Union in Cardiff. And he played in the Crown Buildings in Gibraltar. And he played 30 of us at chess.
How many did he win?
29. And he drew one with a Cowbridge schoolboy. Cowbridge schoolboy drew his match, and the other 29 lost. He beat the champions and everything. He was a lovely man. Was Yuri? It was Spassky. Really nice. But lots of them. But all the Russians and everybody we met were nice. You know, it was.
So what we ought to do. Now the only thing we didn't talk about is the war.
Yeah.
I've left that till last. I think.
Yeah.
Otherwise there'd be no room for anything else.
Yeah. Well, I think generally.
Yeah.
You've got to fight the buggers. It's no good ever. Have you started again?
Yeah.
Well, whatever it is, if you're the only one, or you think you're the only one, and you think there's something wrong that deserves to be challenged, you should challenge it. And I've seen it happen time and time again. We had, I could tell you his name in the Union, and he was a conservative. He was a conservative activist, and he was a full-time worker for the civil service union, not the civil service, the one I was in, the Society of Civil Servants, the executive union, and his name was Wheeler. And he was late coming to a meeting once, and we had one lad called Waggett. I think he's a priest now or something, or a vicar. But anyway, he was very unorthodox, but and he suddenly at the meeting, before the meeting started, whilst we were waiting for him to become, this secretary to turn up, he said, I don't think much of John Wheeler. He said, he's never doing his job fully and good enough for my big book, and so on. And everybody sort of went quiet because, suddenly the main officer of the union had been challenged and not doing his job.
Yeah.
And then somebody else spoke up and said, yeah, well, when he came to Newcastle, we didn't think much of him, you see. And somebody else from, where was it, Cardiff, said they didn't think much of him. And before the bugger came, it was all set up, we were going to get rid of him. And he came to the conclusion he was on his 11th month. If we got rid of him before 12 months, and no compensation, you see, his trial year, we got rid of him. Well, he became a Tory MP, and he became first of all an MEP, then a Tory MP, and he ended up as a minister in the Tory government, the bastard. And bloody useless he was, honestly. But there you are. But you see, that one lad who spoke up triggered it all off, didn't he? Just by one person. voicing his opinion. It sometimes works. He wasn't a communist.
So after you were put back into Belgium,
It was good fun, that.
Why didn't you carry on in medical things then after the war?
I don't know, I think I'd had enough of it soon. I could have done, but I
Could
didn't.
you have gone on to be a doctor or something, no?
Yes, that would have been logical. Yeah, you're quite right. Because I came out of the army, I could have gone to university. So I could have gone to university, I could have studied medicine and gone to be a doctor. I think I'd had enough because, you know, you get unsympathetic to your patients because there's so many, and sometimes they were so badly wounded and so on that you couldn't afford sympathy. That wouldn't do you any good. You just, I didn't remember. Strangely enough, I met one man that lost both feet on a mine, and it was in where Mum and Dad lived in that place in Bournemouth. It was Billy, his name was, and he'd lost both legs. And he was in the Wiltshire Regiment, and probably he said that I was one of the stretcher bearers that carried him out. And he could have been, for all I know. I wouldn't remember. But there it is.